You have a Congress in particular which is becoming anti-Semitic. You have AOC +3. You have those people, Ilhan Omar, she hates Jewish people. And you have to be very careful because there's been a big change. You know, if you go back 15 years ago, I'm not Jewish, but my father was very friendly with many, many Jewish people, was honored by Federation. I would go with him to Federation of Jewish Philanthropies and many other things. And we grew up respecting and loving Jewish people. You know, you don't even think about it in Brooklyn and Queens mostly. And my father didn't go to Manhattan.
Listen to what you just witnessed, because I want you to understand something visceral about authoritarian politics and the mechanics of manufactured fear. And before I'm through here, you're going to see how this connects not just to Trump opening Hanukkah celebrations at the White House by accusing Congress of being anti-Semitic and slamming Representatives Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but to the entire architecture of right-wing power consolidation happening in real time across this country. Trump claimed that Ilhan Omar hates Jewish people, and what you need to grasp immediately is that this isn't some off-the-cuff remark or random bigotry spilling out during a holiday speech. This is calculated authoritarian strategy weaponizing a sacred Jewish festival and hijacking legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism to accomplish something far more sinister than mere electoral politics. And I'm going to walk you through exactly how this works and why it should terrify every single person who cares about democratic discourse and human rights and the very possibility of criticizing state violence without being branded a bigot, the audacity of standing in front of a menorah and perverting a celebration of religious freedom into a platform for targeting a black Muslim woman in Congress with demonstrably false accusations should make your blood absolutely boil, because what Trump is doing here extends far beyond Ilhan Omar herself. And here's the bombshell you need to understand first, the context that makes this especially grotesque right now. Trump's escalating attacks on Minnesota's Somali community and his calls for the deportation of Ilhan Omar show a shift from a policy of racist dog whistles to one of openly xenophobic tirades, and just days before this Hanukkah speech, Trump lashed out at Ilhan Omar during his cabinet meeting, calling the congresswoman garbage and saying he doesn't want Somali immigrants in the country, while she's a U.S. citizen who became naturalized 25 years ago after fleeing civil war as a child. Trump said she hates everybody, hates Jewish people, hates everybody, during that same cabinet meeting. So understand the pattern emerging here, because this is systematic dehumanization happening at the highest levels of American government, and it's accelerating. Now let me expose the deeper manipulation at work, because Trump isn't just attacking Omar. He's deploying what scholars and Jewish activists themselves have identified as the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And this is where the analysis gets absolutely crucial, because the exploitation of accusations of anti-Semitism, especially to counter anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel, is sometimes called weaponization of anti-Semitism. Kenneth Stern, director of the Center for the Study of Hate at Bard College and the lead drafter of the IHRA Working Definition of Anti-Semitism, said the Trump administration's approach is making Jewish students feel less safe when asked directly about Trump's tactics. And Stern said the weaponization approach makes them less safe rather than protecting Jewish communities from genuine anti-Semitic threats. Think about that staggering irony for a moment. The man who literally drafted the international definition of anti-Semitism is telling us that Trump's deployment of these accusations is itself endangering Jewish people. One expert explained that Trump is trying to weaken democratic institutions, he's trying to eviscerate academic freedom, and his weapon of choice, or at least one of his favorite weapons, is anti-Semitism, accusations of anti-Semitism, across universities and law firms and schools. But here comes the really devastating part that connects everything together, because Omar herself said, "There's this creepy obsession that he seems to have on me that just feels pretty obnoxious." Omar said the attacks have caused increased death threats, and at one point resulted in a need for a 6-person security detail. So understand the material consequences of Trump's rhetoric. These aren't abstract political disagreements happening in some sealed chamber of policy debate. These are coordinated attacks from the President of the United States that generate real violence and real terror against a sitting member of Congress who happens to be a black Muslim woman refugee, and the fact that Trump chose a Hanukkah celebration to amplify these attacks reveals the cynicism at the core of his strategy, because he's instrumentalizing Jewish safety concerns to advance white nationalist xenophobia, while simultaneously manipulating Jewish fear in order to achieve authoritarian goals, which anti-Semites love because it puts Jews in the middle and makes Jewish communities complicit in attacks on other marginalized groups. Let's talk about what Omar actually said and did, because the historical record matters enormously here, when we're dealing with manufactured scandal, and the clips you constantly see recycled through right-wing media always reference her 2019 comments about AIPAC and lobbying influence. And yes, Omar questioned the financial relationship between AIPAC and members of Congress in tweets, saying it's all about the Benjamins, baby. And when asked who she thought was paying lawmakers, she replied AIPAC, and she apologized after criticism from her own party leadership, acknowledging the history of anti-Semitic tropes even as she maintained the legitimacy of discussing lobbying power. And here's what gets completely erased from the narrative. Criticizing the influence of a political lobbying organization is not the same thing as hating Jewish people, and conflating those two things is precisely how this weaponization functions to shut down any examination of how American foreign policy gets shaped. The sophistication required to understand that you can critique Israeli government actions or American political lobbying without harboring animus toward Jewish people as an ethnic or religious group seems to completely evaporate in our public discourse the moment these accusations get deployed, and that's intentional because accusations of anti-Semitism are increasingly being used not as tools for justice and resolution, but as weapons of political convenience, and this makes fighting genuine anti-Semitism vastly more difficult. And let me be absolutely clear about where real anti-Semitism actually comes from in this country right now, because anti-Semitism in the US is a real and dangerous phenomenon, most pressingly from the alt-right white supremacist politics that have become alarmingly mainstream since 2016, and you know who's been coddling and enabling those forces. The same man now standing at a Hanukkah event claiming Congress is anti-Semitic, while members of his own political coalition march with tiki torches chanting "Jews will not replace us" in Charlottesville, the same man who told Proud Boys to stand back and stand by, the same political movement that traffics constantly in globalist conspiracy theories where globalist is just a code word for Jew. According to scholars tracking anti-Semitic discourse, and suddenly we're supposed to believe Trump is the defender of Jewish safety? The cognitive dissonance required to accept this narrative should be causing mental whiplash, except it's not about logical consistency, it's about power and control, and silencing dissent. Let me take you even deeper into the mechanics of this authoritarian playbook, because what Trump did in that speech reveals something Hannah Arendt understood about totalitarian movements, which is that they thrive on the constant rewriting of reality and the deliberate confusion of categories to prevent clear thinking and organized resistance. Notice how Trump seamlessly transitions in his comments from talking about AOC+3, his reductive dismissive label for the squad that already signals his contempt for women of color in Congress, to claiming you have a Congress in particular, which is becoming anti-Semitic. You have AOC+3. You have those people, Ilhan Omar, she hates Jewish people, and then he wanders off into this bizarre rambling nostalgia about Brooklyn and Queens and his father being honored by Jewish philanthropic organizations, as if his personal proximity to Jewish people somehow immunizes him from criticism or grants him authority to determine who does and doesn't hate Jews. And this is classic authoritarian rhetoric where personal anecdote and hereditary association substitute for actual analysis or evidence. And speaking of evidence, let's examine what Trump is actually claiming here, because the statement "she hates Jewish people" is not a policy disagreement, it's a totalizing character assassination that attributes internal emotional states and motivations without any evidentiary basis whatsoever, and more than that, it's a form of essentialism that reduces Omar's complex political positions on Israel-Palestine, on American foreign policy, on lobbying and campaign finance, on international human rights law, into a simple declaration of ethnic or religious hatred. This is McCarthyism updated for the 21st century, and, as one former Harvard Hillel director warned, today's McCarthyist tactic of manufacturing an anti-Semitism scare turns the very real issue of Jewish safety into a pawn in a cynical political game to cover for Israel's deeply unpopular policies with regard to Palestine, and that's coming from someone who spent decades as a Jewish leader and educator, not from some outside critic but from within the Jewish community itself pushing back against this manipulation. Here's another bombshell dimension to this that demonstrates the international scope of what we're witnessing, because Trump made these comments in the context of extending love and prayers to Australians after Sydney's Bondi Beach terror attack, which involved Islamic State flags, and watch how smoothly he transitions from discussing an ISIS-inspired terrorist attack in Australia to accusing a Muslim member of Congress of hating Jews, as if there's some natural connection between these things, as if Ilhan Omar shares responsibility for violence committed by terrorists on the other side of the planet, simply because she's Muslim, and this is the essence of collective blame and guilt by association that violates every principle of individual responsibility that supposedly undergirds liberal democracy. The message being sent is unmistakable. Muslims are suspect. Muslims in positions of power are especially dangerous, and Muslim critics of Israel are by definition anti-Semites who hate Jewish people in Trump's formulation, and this racialized religious profiling happening from the presidential podium should alarm everyone regardless of their position on Middle East politics. Now I want you to understand the material consequences of this discourse beyond just the death threats Omar personally receives, because the administration canceled $400 million in federal funding to Columbia University, claiming the school failed to address anti-Semitism on campus, and the Department of Education sent letters to 60 colleges and universities warning they are under investigation for accusations of anti-Semitism. And this is the operational implementation of the rhetorical strategy. You create this expansive definition where criticism of Israeli policy or support for Palestinian rights gets labeled anti-Semitic. You position yourself as the defender of Jewish students and Jewish safety, and then you use the power of the federal government to financially punish and legally threaten institutions that allow pro-Palestinian activism or speech. This is authoritarian governance 101. You identify an enemy, you create a moral panic around that enemy, using the language of protecting vulnerable groups, and then you deploy state power to crush dissent while claiming you're the defender of the oppressed. As one expert explained, Trump's trying to weaken democratic institutions and eviscerate academic freedom, and his weapon of choice is accusations of anti-Semitism, which manipulates Jewish fear to achieve authoritarian goals that ultimately endanger everyone, including Jewish communities themselves. Let me give you the philosophical and historical framework for understanding why this tactic is so devastatingly effective, because we're dealing with what Foucault would call a discourse of power that operates by controlling the terms of acceptable speech, and once you establish that certain critiques are by definition bigoted, you've eliminated the possibility of those critiques being heard or engaged with on their merits, that you've moved the debate from the substance of Israeli military actions or settlement policies or American military aid to the character and motivations of the critic, and in that move you've won, because now we're not talking about Gaza or the West Bank or international law. We're talking about whether so-and-so is an anti-Semite, and the person accused is immediately on the defensive trying to prove a negative, trying to demonstrate that they don't harbor hatred in their heart, which is an impossible position because how do you prove internal emotional states, especially when your accusers have already decided that your political positions are themselves evidence of your bigotry? This is the perfect Kafkaesque trap, and it's being deployed systematically across American political and cultural institutions right now, and here's where it gets even more insidious, because those accusing protesters of anti-Semitism do not appear to consider the many Jews among the protesters as Jews, arguing in effect that Jews can only be Jews if they support Israel, which is an anti-Semitic idea itself, because the idea that all Jews should hold the same views by virtue of their identity is anti-Semitic, and this is such a crucial point that deserves extended reflection. The weaponization of anti-Semitism accusations actually relies on an anti-Semitic premise, the premise that Jews are a monolith who all think alike about Israel-Palestine, and any Jew who deviates from supporting Israeli government policy gets labeled a self-hating Jew, or gets their Jewish identity questioned or denied. Charges of anti-Semitism made in bad faith have been described as a smear tactic, and when used against Jews has been said to take the form of labeling as self-hating Jews. So the very tactic meant to supposedly combat anti-Semitism is actually reinforcing anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish political uniformity and dual loyalty. Let's connect this to the broader architecture of Republican strategy, because what Trump is doing with Omar is part of a larger pattern of attacking the squad, these progressive women of color who represent the demographic and ideological future that terrifies the Republican Party, and every single member has been subjected to racist attacks, to questions about their loyalty, to suggestions that they should go back to where they came from even though they're American citizens and representatives. And remember, at a campaign rally in Greenville, North Carolina, Trump did not intervene but just stood on stage for 13 seconds as supporters chanted "Send her back," targeting Omar, a naturalized U.S. citizen who fled Somalia as a refugee in her youth, and that chant, "Send her back," is eliminationist rhetoric. It's the language of ethnic cleansing imported into American electoral politics, and Trump stood there and let it happen and then defended his supporters afterward. So spare me the notion that his current attacks are motivated by genuine concern about anti-Semitism, when his entire political project has been animated by white nationalist resentment of demographic change and the growing political power of communities of color. The historical parallel I want you to grasp here connects to how European fascism in the 20th century operated by identifying internal enemies who were supposedly disloyal or hateful or dangerous to the national body, and those accusations served to justify increasingly severe forms of exclusion and violence. And while I'm not saying we're at that endpoint, I am saying that the rhetorical architecture being constructed right now with Trump's attacks on Omar and other squad members, with the systematic attempts to label progressive critics of Israel as anti-Semites, with the deployment of federal power to punish universities and silence activists, all of this is laying groundwork for authoritarian governance that should alarm anyone who understands how democracies die. Omar herself said, "His presidency has exposed some weaknesses that exist, and it has certainly taught us that, while our institutions are strong, they are fragile to a dictatorship-like ruler, and she's absolutely right to identify the authoritarian nature of what we're witnessing." Now let me take you to perhaps the most important dimension of this entire analysis, because we need to talk about Palestine and why criticism of Israeli policy generates such fierce backlash in American politics. And here's what gets systematically erased from our discourse. Israel's weaponization of anti-Semitism is used to muzzle legitimate criticisms of its continuous occupation of Palestinians, now labeled apartheid by B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization. So we're not even talking about some fringe left position here. We're talking about leading human rights organizations, including Israeli ones, using the term apartheid to describe the reality on the ground. And when Amnesty International published a report in February 2022 saying Israel was committing apartheid, Israel rejected the report's findings and denounced it as anti-Semitic, and Amnesty Secretary General Agnes Callamard rejected the Israeli officials' responses as baseless attacks, barefaced lies, fabrications on the messenger, and human rights advocates subsequently argued that the criticism of the report constituted weaponization of anti-Semitism. So even the world's most respected human rights organizations get smeared with accusations of anti-Semitism when they document violations of international law. And this should tell you everything about how these accusations function to shield state violence from accountability. The stakes here are impossibly high because we're talking about a decades-long military occupation. We're talking about settlements that violate international law. We're talking about a siege of Gaza that human rights organizations have documented as producing humanitarian catastrophe. We're talking about at least 35,000 Palestinians dead in the wake of the October 7th attacks, according to reporting from earlier this year, and any attempt to discuss American complicity in this or to advocate for Palestinian human rights gets immediately met with accusations of anti-Semitism that are designed to shut down the conversation. And political scientist Omar Shahabuddin Makdoum wrote in the Journal of Genocide Research in September 2025 that Israel's supporters have exploited the accusation of anti-Semitism as a technique of Gaza genocide denial, so scholars are now documenting how these accusations serve to provide cover for what some are calling genocidal violence, and that's published in peer-reviewed genocide studies journals. This isn't fringe rhetoric. This is serious academic analysis of how weaponized anti-Semitism accusations function in the current moment. And here's what makes Trump's deployment of this tactic especially dangerous and hypocritical, because his own administration and political movement have been characterized by actual anti-Semitic associations and rhetoric. And Trump chillingly told representatives of the American Jewish community on the occasion of Rosh Hashanah 2020, "We love your country," suggesting they are not Americans, which is itself an anti-Semitic trope about dual loyalty. The very thing Omar was accused of invoking when she talked about lobbying influence. So Trump literally engages in the exact anti-Semitic framing that he accuses others of, while positioning himself as the defender of Jewish people. And the contradiction is so blatant it would be comical if it weren't so dangerous. And during the January 2021 Capitol insurrection, the insurgency displayed support of Zionism through use of the Israeli flag, which is not inconsistent with the explicit anti-Semitism captured in shirts and other neo-Nazi paraphernalia, because white nationalists take from Euro-Zionism's textbook aspirations for ethno-religious supremacist political hegemony, and there is no room for Jews in white nationalists, as articulated by figures like Richard Spencer, who has expressed admiration for Zionism's ethnocracy, even while promoting explicitly anti-Semitic white nationalism. So the ideological alignment here is between right-wing ethno-nationalism in its various forms, not between Trump and actual Jewish safety. Let me bring this back to the specific clip you watched because I want you to notice the rhetorical slippage in Trump's speech, the way he moves from claiming Congress is becoming anti-Semitic, as if this is some gradual transformation happening to the institution, to identifying specific members, to making the personal claim that Omar hates Jewish people, and then notice the digression about his father in Brooklyn and Queens and Jewish philanthropies, And what he's doing in that digression is establishing his credentials, his bona fides, his proximity to Jewish communities, as if that grants him the authority to determine who does and doesn't hate Jews. And this is a classic move in reactionary rhetoric where personal anecdote substitutes for structural analysis, where "my father had Jewish friends" becomes the basis for making sweeping accusations about the anti-Semitism of others, and the nostalgia embedded in that digression is also doing work because he's implicitly contrasting some imagined harmonious past where everyone respected and loving Jewish people with a corrupt present where Congress has become anti-Semitic. And this nostalgic frame is central to reactionary politics, which always operates by constructing some golden age that's been lost and identifying the villains responsible for that loss. And the villains in Trump's narrative are invariably women of color, immigrants, Muslims, progressives, anyone who represents demographic and ideological change in America. And the fact that he's using accusations of anti-Semitism to attack these groups reveals the opportunistic cynicism at the core of this strategy, because Trump doesn't actually care about Jewish safety. If he did, he wouldn't be trafficking in globalist conspiracy theories and dual loyalty accusations and standing by while his supporters chant "Jews will not replace us." What he cares about is finding rhetorically effective weapons to deploy against his political enemies, and accusations of anti-Semitism are powerful weapons in American political discourse because of the historical weight of the Holocaust and the genuine reality of anti-Semitic violence. So Trump is exploiting that historical trauma and that real violence to score cheap political points against a Muslim woman in Congress who has been critical of his policies, and the grotesqueness of that exploitation should be absolutely clear to anyone paying attention. Now let me tell you why this matters beyond just the immediate political theater, because what we're witnessing is the construction of a new McCarthyism, where the accusation alone is enough to destroy careers and reputations, where defending yourself against accusations of anti-Semitism requires proving a negative and demonstrating your pro-Israel credentials, where institutions are so terrified of being labeled anti-Semitic that they preemptively silence Palestinian voices and progressive critics. As one former Harvard Hillel director explained, he sees a disturbing trend gripping our campus and many others: the cynical weaponization of anti-Semitism by powerful forces who seek to intimidate and ultimately silence legitimate criticism of Israel and of American policy on Israel. And reft, he said plainly, it is not anti-Semitic to demand justice for all Palestinians living in their ancestral lands, and the activists who employ this language and the politics of liberation are sincere people. Their cause is a legitimate and important movement, dissenting against the brutal treatment of Palestinians that has been ongoing for 75 years, and they must be allowed to speak safely and afforded the respect their morally serious position deserves. And again, this is coming from someone who spent 13 years living in Jerusalem and led Harvard Hillel for 17 years. This isn't some outside agitator. This is a Jewish leader with deep personal and professional investment in these questions, pushing back against the weaponization he's witnessing. The question we have to ask ourselves is what kind of political culture we want to inhabit, because if criticism of any state's policies can be automatically dismissed as bigotry against the ethnic or religious group associated with that state, then we've eliminated the possibility of accountability for state violence. We've created a system where certain actors are immune from criticism, and that's fundamentally incompatible with democratic governance or human rights frameworks or international law. And as one analysis explained, the issue becomes more complex and troubling when the label of anti-Semitism is deployed to silence political opponents, particularly around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And unfortunately, the accusation of anti-Semitism has become a powerful rhetorical tool in public discourse. And while vigilance against genuine anti-Semitism is crucial, there is growing concern that the charge is increasingly being weaponized by special interest groups to stifle criticism, silence political opponents, and advance unrelated ideological agenda. And this concern is coming from across the political spectrum, including from within Jewish communities themselves, who recognize that this weaponization ultimately makes fighting real anti-Semitism more difficult. And that's the final cruel irony I want you to grasp here. Because by crying wolf, by labeling every criticism of Israeli policy as anti-Semitic, by attacking Palestinian rights advocates and progressive politicians as Jew haters, the right is actually desensitizing people to accusations of anti-Semitism. They're making it harder to identify and combat genuine anti-Semitic threats. They're providing cover for actual anti-Semites by muddying the waters about what anti-Semitism means. And, as one analyst warned, the more the Israeli lobby and other Zionist groups weaponize anti-Semitism to allow the Israeli state to cement and expand its colonization of Palestine, the less effective the fight against real anti-Semitism becomes. and Jewish communities are left more vulnerable as a result. So the very people Trump claims to be defending are being put at greater risk by his tactical deployment of these accusations. And Jewish activists and scholars are increasingly speaking out about this dynamic, even as they get ignored or attacked by the same forces that claim to speak for Jewish safety. So when you watch Trump stand at that Hanukkah event and declare that Ilhan Omar hates Jewish people, understand what you're witnessing. You're watching authoritarian politics in action. You're watching the weaponization of anti-Semitism accusations to silence critics of American foreign policy and Israeli military action. You're watching racist and Islamophobic attacks disguised as concern for Jewish safety. You're watching the construction of an enemy within who can be blamed and targeted and potentially eliminated from political life. And you're watching the perversion of a sacred Jewish holiday into a platform for bigotry and political opportunism, and every single one of those things should fill you with moral outrage and political determination, because this is how democracies die, this is how fascism takes root, this is how marginalized communities get scapegoated, and violence gets normalized, and dissent gets criminalized, and we cannot allow it to happen without the fiercest possible resistance, not just for Ilhan Omar's sake, but for the sake of everyone who might someday need to criticize their government's policies without being labeled a bigot, for the sake of Palestinian human rights and dignity, for the sake of Jewish communities who deserve better than to have their trauma weaponized for authoritarian ends, and for the sake of the very possibility of democratic politics in an age of rising fascism worldwide, because that's what's actually at stake in this moment. And that's why Trump's Hanukkah speech deserves not just criticism but systematic deconstruction and relentless opposition from everyone who claims to care about justice.